case S02E08. Slowburn Shakespeare. Part 6 of 6. The stars are fire. Welcome back. This probably feels a bit like the exposition that you get in those police procedurals on channels that shall remain nameless, where every time you come back after a coffee break or an ad break, there is lengthy exposition as one of the characters reminds you where you've gotten up to, so you don't have to invest too much mental energy into keeping up. So, bear with me as I go through yet more exposition just to remind you where you are indeed up to. For those people who don't binge listen to like 6 episodes in a row, because, most people don't. Okay, so by the time you've reached this point in the miniseries, the last episode about Shakespeare, probably, you might imagine that there really cannot be much more to add to the debate around Shakespeare's authorship. We've looked at the Apocrypha, the plays that some want to include in the canon and others want to exclude from it. We've looked at the canon itself, based on the idea of this first folio, and the idea that someone other than the Stratford Glover's son, William Shakespeare, wrote those works. We've gone through 4 individual candidates: Francis Bacon, Edward de Vere, Christopher Marlowe, and William Stanley. And whilst some of them have seemed faintly possible, or at least a lot of fun, none of them really reached a quantum of evidence sufficient to cast enough reasonable doubt or to convince enough people. We looked at evidence that has taken the shape of biographical analyses, both comparing life histories against documents that survive from the times and trying to divine authorial profiles from the content of the plays themselves. We've had cipher-based decryption, attempts to hunt down secret messages hidden in Shakespeare's writings. Sometimes you just, overlay a cosmological chart and it all comes clear. We've even had document analysis, aging and dating papers to see if they match the era they are supposedly from. We've had handwriting analysis. We've even had genetic testing. But of course, the sort of evidence that listeners of this podcast are perhaps most interested in, and the kind that's actually been fairly thin on the ground to press, is the language. Linguistic analyses. We've had a little, of course, but even some of that has been pretty ropey sometimes. In the weakest cases, various antis have had nothing more concrete to point to than textual allusions, hints in poetry, clever plays on words with subtly alternative meanings, parallels between plays and lives. We have had some slightly more compelling insights. In the strongest cases, we've had really marked similarities. So remember that example from the 4th part of the miniseries, that's like 2 whole episodes ago. So listen again to these 2 lines from Christopher Marlowe. "But stay, what star shines yonder in the east? The lodestar of my life, if Abigail." And now compare them with these 2 lines from Shakespeare. "But soft, what light through yonder window breaks? It is the east, and Juliet is the sun." Extremely interesting, but it doesn't quite a murder make, though. We've even looked into early computational linguistic analyses done by Claremont colleges, and there we stopped. It would be reasonable to imagine, by this stage, that there cannot be anything left to say on the topic. No stone unturned, no corner left to peek around. But you would be wrong. I have barely scratched the surface thus far, and there is a last huge mountain that we haven't even started up yet. Before we get there, though, it's also useful to notice that we could go back over a lot of the old ground and plough it again in an entirely new way. Perhaps the best thing about authorship analysis is that it's a very broad church. if you have a reasonable chunk of digitized language, there are innumerable ways that you can come at it, and the modern era gives us advantages that the scholars of the 1800s and 1900s and even most of the 2000s simply didn't have. Computing. Okay, yes, you would be right to point out that Claremont colleges also had computing, but I would argue that theirs was from an era that has now faded into relative antiquity. I mean, just as the computers of today will seem prehistoric in only a couple of decades' time. Our current machines have faster processors and, more importantly, they have friendlier software. The kinds of interfaces accessible to people whose expertise is in Shakespeare rather than in computing. That's a big shift and an important one. Computer experts who just happen to analyse language can still do their thing, but now the field is also open to linguists, language lovers, who happen to use computers, and that's a much larger pool of people. And it's from the confluence of these ultra-modern phenomena, the digitisation of older texts, the radical advancement of computing, and the creation of widely accessible software, that we arrive at our last step in this version of the Shakespeare story. Welcome to On Claire, an archive of forensic linguistics, literary detection, and language mysteries. You can find case notes about this episode, including credits, acknowledgements, and links to further reading at the blog. The web address is given at the end of this podcast. Now, those of you with an amazing memory may have thought you were going to head into 2016 at this point. Wrong. As usual, before we go forward, Marty, first we must go back. 30 years back. This final chapter of the story starts in 1986, when Oxford University Press, OUP, published the Oxford Shakespeare. One volume in that Oxford Shakespeare is William Shakespeare, A Textual Companion. One is William Shakespeare, an old spelling edition, and they pretty much do what they say on the tin. But the one that we're most interested in, the headlining volume, is The Complete Works. As you should have already realised by now, just the name itself is automatically, if implicitly, a statement about authorship, about the Apocrypha, about the canon, about what a collection of people have decided to include or exclude as the work of William Shakespeare, based on sometimes fairly thin evidence. As seems to just be the case in this field, this new volume raised fierce debates, since it tried to replicate plays and poems not as they were printed, but as they were performed. And as I discussed right back at the start of this mini-series, this is somewhat like taking a screenshot during a video and deciding that this single freeze frame is a fair, canonical representation of the whole video. This snapshot is Hamlet, this snapshot is Macbeth, and so on. Lots of people were not happy with this performance over print decision because it meant, in some cases, substantial changes to comfortable, long-established ideas. For instance, Hamlet had whole speeches relegated to an appendix. You can probably hear people falling onto their fainting couches as I speak. King Lear had to be put in twice because it came down to two very different versions, and it wasn't clear enough to the editors which one had the greatest claim to being anointed the one true king. And perhaps most scandalous of all, some of the works had the names of collaborators included. Other co-authors: Thomas Middleton, George Wilkins, John Fletcher, anonymous. For some absolute Shakespeare purists, this would have been enough to trigger a flurry of outrage letters to newspapers. Anyway, This first edition of the complete works in 1986 was edited by John Jowett, William Montgomery, Gary Taylor, he's actually come up a few times and we'll come back to him again, and Stanley Wells. If you have an outstanding memory, you might recall Stanley Wells from his rather interesting comment, which was part of a longer article that vanished first from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust site and then from the Royal Shakespeare Company site. And it's worth revisiting in light of this Oxford Shakespeare series. Wells wrote, "The phenomenon of disbelief in Shakespeare's authorship is a psychological aberration of considerable interest. Endorsement of it in favour of aristocratic candidates may be ascribed to snobbery, reluctance to believe that works of genius could emanate from a man of relatively humble origin, an attitude that would not permit Marlowe to have written his own works, let alone Shakespeare's. Other causes include ignorance, poor sense of logic, refusal, willful or otherwise, to accept evidence, folly, the desire for publicity, and even, as in the sad case of Delia Bacon, who hoped to open Shakespeare's grave in 1856, certifiable madness." To me, it's a little difficult to reconcile this statement with being the editor of a series of volumes that then goes on to explicitly reshape the authorship of Shakespeare by suggesting a range of collaborators. I imagine if Wells cared what I think, which I expect he doesn't, I'm guessing he might say that his contention is with people who reject Shakespeare entirely and substitute their own reality. But yet, this edition was obviously open to the idea that authorship in works from this era is not as cut and dried as lots of people imagine. I mean, if it were crystal clear, there wouldn't be plays marked as collaborations with multiple unidentified writers. It seems like it's okay for people like Wells to ask the question, who wrote this play? But somehow it's not okay for some others, and I find that a really interesting and not a particularly nice aspect to this area of academia. Anyway, it takes us right back to the cutout theory, or one version of it anyway, this groupist theory that I went through at the very start of the miniseries. Now, if you remember, roughly speaking, the groupist theory had about 3 versions. So, version 1, Shakespeare doesn't exist at all. The name is just a pseudonym that a bunch of people are using. He is as much a fiction as the 3 witches. Any similarities to people living or dead are purely coincidental, etc., etc. Version 2. Shakespeare exists, but he's, just a theatre manager. Maybe he's just a part-time actor, whatever he is. He's letting the writers use his name because reasons. Maybe they're hiring it from him, whatever. Version 3. He is either a part of or the leader of a group of writers all publishing under his name. So in the final version, he is in fact a writer. In the previous 2 versions, he doesn't write either because he doesn't exist or because he just doesn't have the talent. Anyway, bingo. This is the version that comes into play here. As I mentioned earlier, basically, collaboration. So some collaborate on some sets of plays, some pen the lines for certain scenes or characters in other plays, Shakespeare reimagines something of theirs, they adapt something of his. Sometimes it's just one author, sometimes a few are free at the same time and they all work together at once. But essentially, you end up with other, and sometimes very famous, co-writers working alongside Shakespeare without necessarily getting the credit for it later on down the line. Now, when the new edition of this Shakespeare series came out, this venture into authorial territory, these efforts to fill in the blanks on the Shakespeare map, if you will, went even further. The 2005 Complete Works volume added in the plays Sir Thomas More and Edward III, not because Shakespeare wrote them, but because both contained a few passages that might be by Shakespeare. Those of you with incredible memories will even remember that this was borne out in the financial documents of Shakespeare essentially taking on a bit of paid jobbing work to do some lines in Sir Thomas More. In other words, in these plays, Shakespeare was, at best, second author, if that, maybe. And now at long last we move forward to 2016 and OUP's release of their top-of-the-line, ruinously expensive series, The New Oxford Shakespeare. After its predecessor, some may have been well prepared for what was to come, but after the 3-volume 1986 version, this new 3, soon to be 5-volume update included an entire 776-page book entitled The New Oxford Shakespeare, The Authorship Companion by Gary Taylor, again, we'll come back to him, and Gabriel Egan. As the title suggests, The Authorship Companion, in it, Taylor and Egan pick up this now ancient question: did Shakespeare write all the works attributed to him? Okay, I should be fair, their angle is perhaps a little better defined as, did Shakespeare write at least some of this play, like, even just a bit of it, a couple of verses maybe? Was anyone else involved? Who did which bits? Why is this such a mess? Okay, maybe not the last question, that's probably just people like me who mutter that when analysing data. Anyway, theirs isn't automatically the people hiding behind pseudonyms to avoid execution subterfuge version of the question. Theirs is flat out someone saying, yeah, but this manuscript doesn't actually even have a name on it, and someone's patently added stuff in different handwriting afterwards, so obviously other people were involved, so is this part of the collection or no? And echoing the old 1986 series, the headlining volume of this new edition is, to give it its full name, The New Oxford Shakespeare, The Complete Works, Modern Critical Edition. I mean, I guess it isn't properly monumental unless it has a title, subtitle, and a subtitle. Maybe I'll write a book that good one day. So this particular volume lists the editors as Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boras, and Gabriel Egan. Stanley Wells doesn't appear, but I assume that this was because he was in his 80s when this new edition was being put together, and he's 91 as I record this, so, I think that's kind of fair. It did strike me as interesting, though, that in his absence, as implied by the existence of the authorship companion, this edition goes even further still with the authorship question by including even more possible co-authors, adapters, and revisers. The 2016 Complete Works includes 53 titles. Remember that the first folio contained only 36, and the canon generally stands at 38, so that's already 15 more. These works are mostly plays, some poems, and so forth, and 37 of them have no author listed at all. Implicitly, basically, the editors do not challenge Shakespeare's authorship, either because the evidence to do so is insufficient, or there simply isn't any, there's no case there. But in 16 cases now, both Shakespeare and other names are listed, either as people who have collaborated on that work, or as people who have subsequently adapted that work. And the ordering of the names is indicative of who is deemed to have contributed most. So, how does this list look? Well, let's take some heavyweight classics. A Midsummer Night's Dream, The Comedy of Errors, The Tempest, Romeo and Juliet, all the ones I really hated. According to the New Oxford Shakespeare, they are all shake, no fake. And, as I've said, there are 33 more titles in that list along the same lines. But what about the ones with other authors? Well, there's The Tragedy of M. Arden of Faversham. This was supposedly mainly authored by Anonymous. Yeah, I know. But also by Shakespeare. So that's new. And what about Titus Andronicus? That one is attributed to Shakespeare first, Peele second, and it might even have an added scene possibly by Thomas Middleton ? What else? Well, apparently Marlowe and Anonymous collaborated on all the Henry VI titles, and Nash comes in on the third of those. What about our Shakespeare Apocrypha? So one of those titles was The Passionate Pilgrim. And that one's also included, but it is a mess. Authors are listed as Shakespeare, Barnfield, Griffin, Deloney, Marlowe, Raleigh, and Anonymous, which sounds like a really high interest rate credit card to me. Anyway, let's do some big hitters. Measure for Measure, All's Well That Ends Well, Macbeth. These are all listed as adapted by Middleton. Maybe he has a talent for jazzing up plays, who knows? Last few, you may have forgotten this by now, but remember how I said just after his death Shakespeare was overshadowed for a while by that pair, Beaumont and Fletcher, and that they're another fun little authorship case in their own right? Well, apparently, Fletcher is first author and Shakespeare second on The History of Cardenio, Henry VIII, and The Two Noble Kinsmen. So, for me at least, this is a significant shift in the huge tectonic plate that has historically resisted almost any attempts at being moved. So historically, lots of the people working in the anti-camp were disregarded as being celebrities, lawyers, non-specialists, enthusiasts. They were effectively discredited as being bona fide academics who have properly trained in the subject. But this is a direct contradiction to that. We have specialists in the field making these claims. It also contradicts those quarters who have previously insisted that even having the audacity to doubt Shakespeare's authorship, especially within the canon, that's plays like Macbeth, was embarrassing, misconceived, a psychological aberration. In the complete work's brief discussion on authorship, the editors write that most of the works in this modern critical edition were written entirely by Shakespeare, but a significant number of his plays were written collaboratively, usually with one other playwright as the subordinate partner. Some early modern plays were first written by one author, but later adapted by someone else for a theatrical revival. Shakespeare himself sometimes adapted other men's plays. This edition identifies him as the adapter of 3 plays originally written by other playwrights. But whenever this edition is the first to identify a collaborator or adapter, we treat the attribution more tentatively. In this way, we distinguish between the most secure and well-established attributions and those that are more recent, and therefore intrinsically not yet as widely known, widely tested, or widely endorsed. In cases of collaboration, adaptation, or disputed authorship, the introductory box always provides a cross-reference to the relevant chapters of the authorship companion. Now, I have enough respect for OUP's general credentials, their peer reviewers, their editorial processes, their quality controls, and so forth, to believe that they would not publish absolute snake oil. Not intentionally, anyway. So for me, if OUP thinks this series is worth being published, then in and of itself, its very existence and its undeniable focus on authorship provides evidence that there is indeed room for reasonable doubt, not just around the Apocrypha and the lesser works, but even around the canon. I should add, however, that I don't think it should require a publication like this to exist before anyone is authorised to ask the question for themselves. I stated that position right at the start anyway. If someone wants to question gravity, basically I think that's their fundamental right. Take on the findings of Stephen Hawking, challenge the idea of time, get stuck in, just do it well. So, let's get back to the 2016 New Oxford Shakespeare and its handful of authorship reattributions. The New York Times hailed its arrival with a relatively muted piece, opening with the tentative lines, "Shakespeare may have had a little more help than previously suspected." Not exactly throwing this out as a breaking world exclusive, are they? The BBC, by contrast, was slightly more enthused. Scholars working on New Oxford Shakespeare said his collaboration with other playwrights was more extensive than has previously been known. The research by 23 international scholars has identified 17 of 44 Shakespeare plays as being co-written with other authors. The new research involved both traditional textual analysis and the use of computerized tools to examine the scripts. Gary Taylor, one of the New Oxford Shakespeare's general editors, told The Guardian, We have been able to verify Marlowe's presence in those 3 plays strongly and clearly enough. We can now be confident that they didn't just influence each other, but they worked with each other. Rivals sometimes collaborate. Again, still not throwing a ticker tape parade, really, is it? Anyway, perhaps because of write-ups like this, despite coming out with Oxford University Press, a fairly prestigious publisher, New Oxford immediately met with some vigorous pushback. In the self-same BBC article that I just quoted from a moment ago, we get a response from Carol Rutter, a professor of Shakespeare and performance studies at the University of Warwick. It will still be open for people to make up their own minds. I don't think OUP putting their brand mark on an attribution settles the issue for most people. I believe Shakespeare collaborated with all kinds of people, but I would be very surprised if Marlowe was one of them. The reason for that is that while these were being written, Marlowe was the poster boy of theatre writing. Why would he agree to collaborate with a non-entity of an actor? I would suggest we should look not to another playwright, but to the actors. Yes, Shakespeare collaborated, but it's much more likely that he started his career working for a company where he was already an actor and collaborated not with another playwright, but with the actors, who will have had Marlowe very much in their heads, on the stage, in their voices. They were the ones putting Marlowe's influence into the plays. In case you were wondering at this stage in the miniseries, you weren't, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I am Team Gary Taylor, and I am Team Carol Rutter. What, you might ask, does that mean? How can you be both? Well, just as I absolutely champion the right of someone like Gary Taylor to ask questions and come up with their own answers based, hopefully, on solid scientific principles, I also absolutely champion the right of anyone like Carol Rutter to put any set of methods or results or analyses under the microscope. And I say that no matter how esteemed the person who made the claim, and no matter how junior the one putting it to the test. I've seen good undergraduates debunk the work of distinguished professors. Good science is good science. It doesn't care about your pay grade, the letters after your name, your seniority, provenance, country club friends, ego, whatever. Accordingly, in the rest of this miniseries, I put all the other approaches through their paces, from earls and lords right through to spies and statesmen, pointing out the various issues with each case, and I see absolutely no good reason why that same standard should not apply here. The New Oxford does not get a pass just because it came out with OUP under the auspices of some long-standing figures in the field. But so far, all I've given you are the New Oxford conclusions, and if the past 5 episodes have taught us absolutely anything, it's that the methods, analyses, and interpretations of the results are everything. Woolly, cipher-based ghost chasing? You may find yourself digging up perfectly innocent riverbeds. Overconfident assertions based on incomplete evidence? You may end up emailing out some awkward concessions. Or worse. So what did the New Oxford Shakespeare say and do about authorship? Should we view their results as any more legitimate or meaningful than all the others we've seen so far? Let's take a look at their claims. Bear in mind that in this final section, I'm going to summarise a book of almost 800 pages into a few short minutes, and then do the same with some rebuttals, and even squeak in some counter-rebuttals. The inevitable is going to happen. I am going to end up giving an incomplete picture that simplifies some details and misses out other things entirely. Sadly, that is just the way data compression works. There is a solution, of course. You can read the authorship companion yourself, in full, if you can afford it. As I write this, I checked and it's currently retailing from OUP's site at a cool £145. That's almost exactly $200. And that's just for the authorship companion. If you want all 3 volumes, you're looking at £340, which is about $500. Mercifully, my library has the ebook, otherwise I wouldn't even get to look at a copy. But anyway, OUP's astronomical pricing of knowledge aside, Some might even say overpricing, but there you go. Taylor and Egan didn't just look at language, though we're going to spend much more time on that shortly for obvious reasons. Within the book, they also discuss paleographic and biographical evidence and theatrical provenance. When it comes to language itself, they consider quotations, echoes, prose, rhetorical evidence, chronology, vocabulary, oaths, interjections, cue burden, stage directions, verbal parallels, image clusters, and a whole range of metrical tests, including speech lengths, sentence/verse correlation, Alexandrines, feminine endings, and more. We'll start with the 3 Henry VI plays. So, the first of this trilogy is credited as being written by Marlowe, Nash, and Anonymous, and then subsequently adapted by Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is not given as the author, but as a later influence on the work. Presumably, though, Shakespeare then got a taste for this particular storyline because he's credited as first author on the second and third plays in the Henry VI trilogy. Both of these are supposedly also co-authored by Marlowe and Anonymous, and then also later revised by Shakespeare again. Convoluted, but let's just keep going. The justifications for ascribing authorship in this way are outlined in Egan's chapter about the types of statistical tests that were run on the data. However, several scholars have questioned this chapter on various grounds. For instance, in his 2020 review of the Authorship Companion, Auerbach writes the following, which I have very heavily edited for length. The link is available at the blog if you want to read the whole thing. There is too much that is good in the companion to permit disregarding it. Yet, one concludes the volume with a strong sense of disappointment. A truly useful companion would have summarised the state of the field past and present, breaking down Shakespeare's attributed and questioned works, and the history of attributions made to them. It would have set out attribution techniques and shown their applications and failings. And it would have presented detailed and decisive cases for the new Oxford Shakespeare's bolder attributions, such as assigning part of Arden of Faversham to Shakespeare, and parts of the Henry VI plays to Marlowe. Such a work would be of tremendous use. Instead, what is presented is a partial, in several respects, grab bag, and worse, an unreliable one where valid and invalid methods rub shoulders without the reader being easily able to distinguish between them, and a sense of priorities and proportion is lost in a sea of data. The volume overall has a shambolic feel. Egan sacrifices too much space to unhelpful analogies with forensic earprint evidence and redundant computer storage. Also problematic are questionable priorities. The dubious and marginal Cusum analysis of a funeral elegy is treated at greater length than the entire attribution history of Pericles, and statistical infelicities, which I have discussed elsewhere. Actually, I'm going to come back to these shortly. We reach steadier ground with MacDonald P. Jackson's short but thoughtful piece critiquing recent trigram studies. Jackson's second chapter in the volume offers much to the expert, but little beyond confusion to the readers new to the field at whom the volume is aimed. Taylor and Duhame's study of the fly scene in Titus Andronicus demonstrates the pitfalls of quantitative analysis, however, as a flood of poorly summarized data frequently drowns out the subjective measures being employed. Moreover, in a subsequent article, Taylor leaves the reader uncertain of what standards are being applied and whether they are being applied consistently. Foot shifting between quantitative number crunching and qualitative hermeneutic interpretation, drawing attention to whichever supports the underlying contention of the moment while disparaging the other, is unfortunately far too frequent an occurrence in the companion. Anna Pruitt provides a sober corrective following a procedure that, ironically, a number of other contributors did not. Her article is clear and accessible. I have critiqued 2 of the case studies, those by Elliot Greatley Hirsch and by Pascucci, in detail elsewhere. The methodological problems in both are so great as to cast a pall over the remainder of the volume, and the endorsement of these chapters by the editors, who cite them as foundational support for their summary judgments, is quite troubling. Eliot and Greatley Hirsch's attribution of Arden of Faversham to Shakespeare is ultimately based on a handful of primitive factors far simpler than their elaborate and opaque machine learning-influenced procedures suggest. Pascucci makes a number of very specific and very audacious claims. Both chapters fall significantly below the standards for authorship studies, including those standards set forth in this very volume by Pruitt and Taylor. The volume fails to enforce a consistent standard of scientific rigour, and so the crucial foundation of such an anthology, the authority of its editorial judgment, is fatally jeopardised. There are consequences for the new Oxford Shakespeare more generally. A very real opportunity to provide a solid, comprehensive and authoritative guide to the often arcane field of authorship studies was missed by this volume, and such opportunities do not occur frequently. To a neophyte, the volume is less accessible than purportedly more specialised studies by Jackson and Vickers, as well as less rigorous. Too often this companion is partial, confusing, and worst of all, unreliable. Okay, so I mentioned in the middle of that quote Auerbach's 2020 paper, Statistical Infelicities in the New Oxford Shakespeare Authorship Companion. Given that the Authorship Companion is so heavily statistical in nature, it's worth picking out just a couple of specific instances that can be relatively easily conveyed in audio form. So at the start of the paper, Auerbach argues that the entire volume exhibits a lack of statistical rigour that vexes and ultimately dooms this effort, undermining any certainty that could be assigned to its resolutions. What is Auerbach talking about specifically? Well, one example is thus. In the Authorship Companion, Egan states that once some plays are entirely removed from the accepted canon of Shakespeare, the ranges within which various phenomena must fall in order to be typical of Shakespeare are likely to become narrower simply because we are generating them from a smaller sample. In response to this, Auerbach writes, "Here, Egan seems to have it backward. There is no reason that an arbitrarily smaller sample of Shakespeare would generate more homogeneous results than a larger sample. Rather, the law of large numbers dictates that a smaller sample should show less regularity and more aberration, and simple tools of statistical analysis, such as standard deviations, operate on this fundamental principle. Extreme values are more likely to be tolerated as acceptable outliers in a smaller sample precisely because certainty is lower. More evidence increases certainty rather than decreasing it. The only case in which adding a play to the canon would broaden rather than narrow a model's tolerance of outliers would be if the play was severely and uniquely disjoint in its characteristics compared to all other plays in the canon. The most likely cause of such a disjoint nature, however, would be if a different author had written the play, and the play had been added to the canon in error. Or to put it more succinctly, more data, more certainty, less data, less certainty. And in corpus linguistics, there is a general preference for larger corpora over smaller ones for precisely this reason. To quote, Stalin, "Quantity has a quality all of its own. Sheer brute size smooths out weird anomalies that can easily skew smaller datasets." Now, unfortunately, with historical corpora, the amount of available data is finite. Shakespeare isn't writing any more plays, so we can't add more to the canon. Barring exceptional circumstances, such as the surprising discovery of ancient manuscripts, there simply isn't going to be any more of it, so we do have to work with what exists. Choosing to downsample from what little we have to even less is a precarious step. To do so as a means of homogenizing the data only works if you know that the ones you're removing are, for some reason, unusual, but then you end up facing a whole host of other questions. What are the aberrations in the play that you're removing? Why do they otherwise undermine your research question? What evidence led you to determine that your now excluded pieces were aberrations at all? I mean, with more data, who knows, with plays and poems lost to time, perhaps this was actually a norm and now you've edited it out. If you've artificially homogenized your dataset, then what do your results even mean anymore, since now you've essentially massaged them into showing you something that you want to see? Anyway, what else? Well, In the authorship companion, Egan argues, fairly uncontroversially, that various statistical tests differ in their reliability, but if we apply multiple independent tests to the same data that all point to the same author, then the likelihood that the answer is incorrect drops considerably. Basically, more independent tests all pointing in the same direction probably mean you're looking the right way. This is what we call triangulation, and this is a gold standard in science, and it's a generally widely accepted notion. Unsurprisingly then, Auerbach agrees that this is correct in principle, absolutely, we should all be doing this, but he argues that little effort is made across the entire book to actually establish whether the various statistical tests are genuinely independent. In fact, he argues that they are very likely not to be independent because most of the tests are based on one thing: word frequency. Thus, if the tests are not independent from each other, the fact that their results all agree tells us relatively little about who the author is. So I know that lots of my listeners will not be statistically minded. You came here for language, not for numbers. So I'll try to give a quick analogy, and for those of you who are working in statistics, please forgive me, maybe just mute this bit. So imagine, this is terrible, but go with it. Imagine I hold up a picture of a Labrador, that's a breed of dog. Why am I telling you what a Labrador is? But anyway, a Labrador, a breed of dog. And I ask people to rate how cute the Labrador is. I start out by asking 5 people from the Labrador Appreciation Society. Unbelievably, they all adore it. They all give it 10 out of 10. And I declare that my 5 independent judges have approved my picture. Thus, it is objectively an adorable dog. Well, not really, because the 5 people are not independent judges. They all belong to the same society and they are all impelled by the same bias. Okay, contrast this with, I stand in a busy street somewhere and I ask the passing strangers to rate the same photo. Now, there is a good chance this time that at least some of these strangers will be independent from each other. I mean, sure, I might accidentally ask a pair of friends or both members of a couple or a parent and child, but even if that happens, should all 5 random people now agree that my photo is adorable, then yes, I probably do have a very nice picture of a dog. We can be a bit more certain that this result is a better reflection of wider opinion because there's a far better chance that at least some of these people will be uninfluenced by each other or by an identical background factor. So back to Egan and Auerbach. Auerbach is essentially suggesting that the authorship companion might be an extended work of showing the Labrador picture to multiple members of the Labrador Appreciation Society, that is, a bunch of people who are not independent judges. Moreover, Auerbach is suggesting that we have good reason to believe that they really are all connected in some way because they're all wearing Labrador Appreciation Society badges. Or in the case of the data, the tests are mostly based on word frequency. Statisticians, please don't kill me, I'm trying my best here. Anyway, moving on. In his Statistical Infelicities paper, Auerbach also takes issue with what appears to be cherry-picking. This is the decision to include statistical tests when they agree and discount them when they don't, the accepting of some parts of prior studies that confirm the authorship companion's results, and the rejection of other parts of those very same studies where they contradict, and so on. In summary, just as the results of these studies must be taken in total or not at all, rigour cannot be applied selectively. The presence of fundamental statistical errors in significant passages in the companion has the effect not of casting doubt merely on those particular passages and points, but of bringing into question the robustness of all such conclusions reached. Here is a scientific sloppiness that pervades the entire companion and so disadvantages its overall tenability. In summary then, Auerbach is not really impressed with this volume, but I've quoted from him quite a lot now, and is this just one person on an axe-grinding campaign, or is there a consensus? Well, another critic, Ern, argues that what is striking about these case studies is the confidence with which the conclusions are presented, even when the sample is small. the fly scene is 84 lines long. Or when the extant play, double falsehood, is argued to be an 18th century rewrite of a late 17th century rewrite of the play to which Shakespeare contributed, Cardenio. Even if we grant that significant advances have been made in authorship attribution studies, and this reviewer certainly does, such confidence may nonetheless seem surprising. At the end of his chapter on the authorship of two poems, When God Was Pleased and Shall I Die, that were attributed to Shakespeare in manuscript, Gary Taylor writes, "Until we have better tools, readers must simply make up their own minds, or perhaps preferably, refuse to make up their minds. Yet, elsewhere in the volume, there is little such commendable reluctance to jump to firm conclusions, including by Taylor himself." Owen seems to suggest, if I understand this correctly, that Taylor is preaching, but not practicing. And what I infer in the softest whisper from this, maybe incorrectly, I'm not sure, is that perhaps the lure of the Shakespearean Holy Grail, attributing authorship in a brand new way that will crown Taylor's career with immortal success and grab the headlines and so on, has gotten in the way of rigour and objectivity. Anyone else have issues with this work? Well, Freebury Jones has written a few things on it, but to just take a little snippet, because I've done a lot of quoting already. The new Oxford Shakespeare authorship team argues that Christopher Marlowe had a hand in all three Henry VI plays, and that Shakespeare wrote parts of Arden of Faversham. However, the quantitative methodologies employed to reach these conclusions are dubious. Anything else? Well, last of all, in this gigantic saga, there is the Gary Taylor versus Brian Vickers thing. Okay, honestly, okay, well, I'm just going to quote Vickers, and then I'm going to quote Taylor, and then you can form your own conclusions. So, in the TLS, the Times Literary Supplement in 2020, Vickers published a 3,500-word article. That's about half the length of this episode. It was all about the new Oxford Shakespeare, and Vickers wrote the following. The prime mover in all three revisions to Shakespeare's canon was Gary Taylor, a young American scholar who had just been promoted from editorial assistant to co-editor alongside Stanley Wells, a respected Shakespeare scholar. That's an interesting implicature there. Anyway, moving on. Since no external evidence exists for these ascriptions, Taylor had to rely on other evidence or his own aesthetic judgment. The small rocky island on the new map was a banal lyric, Shall I Die, which Taylor inserted in the canon because in one manuscript the scribe signed it William Shakespeare, increasing its value to other collectors. In fact, it looks like a poem written for music in around 1610. None of Taylor's co-editors, and indeed no other critic, ever endorsed the ascription, but if you're editor of the Oxford Shakespeare, you don't need anyone else's approval. In the press releases and interviews that Taylor gave when the new edition was launched, he described his efforts in triumphalist terms. The new Oxford Shakespeare contained no justification of the attributions. This appeared a year later in an authorship companion edited by Gary Taylor and Gabriel Egan. This bulky volume seems to be a professional scholarly production, but evaluating it properly needs considerable expertise in mathematics, statistics, and computing, as well as Elizabethan drama and textual scholarship. This authorship companion is unfortunate proof that scholars, journal editors, and publishers in the humanities are prone to being abused by pseudo-scientific methods. Every attribution is false. Oxford University Press has a proud record as the world's leading publisher of scholarly editions of English literature. The trust that senior editors placed in Gary Taylor has been repaid with an opportunistic bundle of untested methods set loose on the greatest author in our language. Shakespeare is not just a national, but an international treasure. This might sound familiar. And it is tragic to contemplate the damage done to culture in general by these editions being used to teach students and being sold in bookshops to unsuspecting laymen. The press has just commissioned the new Oxford Marlowe. Among its editors are members of Taylor's editorial team, and rumour suggests that it will include the Henry VI plays. Many people will fervently hope that on reflection the editors will think it enough to have ruined one major author's canon. You might be forgiven for thinking that some of this actually seems kind of bitter and personal, and you will not be surprised to learn that it really does seem to be yet another Shakespeare-driven grudge match between two big names in the field. So 2 years earlier, in 2018, Vickers advertised in the very same Times literary supplement for a publisher for his latest book. And when asked why he needed to go to such a length after the success of publishing 40 previous titles over the span of 50 years, Vickers replied that his reputation as a scholar had been damaged by a string of hostile reviews by people associated with the new Oxford Shakespeare. According to Vickers, he had been turned down by Cambridge University Press, Manchester University Press, and Bloomsbury because their referees deemed him controversial. Taylor's response to this? It is ironic that Brian, who has been writing savage ad hominem reviews in the TLS for 30 years, is blaming his failure to find a publisher on other people's reviewing. I doubt that his conspiracy theories will convince anyone who isn't already paranoid. This thing with conspiracy theories in this field, honestly. Brian's approach to Shakespeare is that there is only one proper way to interpret him. Brian's. The new Oxford Shakespeare, by contrast, is a collaborative edition, and its critical introductions give readers many possible approaches. 1950s approaches, such as Brian's, who is quoted on a number of occasions, but also theatrical, historical, political, formalist, feminist, cinematic, psychological, and eco-critical interpretations. For Brian, Shakespeare is fuel for angry, narcissistic monologues. For us, Shakespeare inspires thousands of fascinating conversations. Interestingly, and I will be done with this soon, I promise, Vickers also seems to imply a sort of narcissism about Taylor when he claims that the authorship question is a matter of scholarly judgment, yes, but also of headline-seeking, power and prestige. My position is that, as a great artist, Shakespeare should not be parcelled off to other writers or saddled with plays that he did not write, such as Arden of Faversham, especially not by such shoddy and bogus scholarly methods. Wow. Okay, well, overall, whilst the new Oxford Shakespeare's authorship companion certainly adds to the conversation on the Shakespearean authorship question, it seems to throw up far more questions than it answers. At the very least, as I noted at the start of this episode, it has successfully generated plenty of controversy and engagement. And in its own right, that new interest can be useful, if channeled properly, into analytical and methodological advancements. Unfortunately, however, Shakespeare may have died 500 years ago, and yet he still manages to create an awful lot of drama, all through the ensuing centuries, right to the present day. And the passions and fervour that his work inspires have arguably held the authorship question back at least as much as they have propelled it forward. For many people in the field, both Stratfordians and antis, the Shakespeare authorship question, in whatever guise, seems to have been a mechanism not so much for advancing science and society and civilization, but rather for advancing CVs and status and success. Finally then, for the very last time in this mini-series, we return to the question that we started out with. Who wrote the works of Shakespeare? What is our answer? Well, we have to acknowledge that as it stands, there is still, as yet, no one answer that satisfies everyone. And to even try to propose one here would be to come between the dragon and his wrath. End of part 6 of 6. If you're interested in more Shakespeare content from linguists at Lancaster, then search the internet for FutureLearn Shakespeare's language. Those 4 words. Future Learn Shakespeare's language. This free online course is all about both revealing the meanings in the works and exploring the myths about Shakespeare in general. And as a bonus, you get introduced to corpus-based methods for analysing Shakespeare. What's not to love? This episode was researched and fact-checked by my research assistant, Rebecca Jagodzinski, and my intern, Debbie Tompkinson. And it was narrated and produced by me, Dr. Claire Hardacre. I am also extremely grateful for all the input I've had from the renowned Shakespeare authority, Professor Jonathan Culpepper, creator of that online course I mentioned, who has patiently entertained this whole mini-series idea from inception to gruesome, bloody execution. However, this work wouldn't exist in its current form without the prior efforts of many, many others. You can find acknowledgements and references at the blog. Also there, you can find data, links, articles, pictures, older cases, and more besides. The address for the blog is wp.lancs.ac.uk/OnClaire, and you can follow the podcast on Twitter at _OnClaire, or if you like, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Claire H.